Well, Pat, it's a great honor to have a chance to have you join me today in conversation about lessons from the past of the chip industry and what it means for the development of the quantum ecosystem today. You've probably done as much as literally anyone in shaping the trajectory of Moore's Law over the past couple of decades in your time at Intel, building the cloud computing industry, now as a venture capitalist at Playground Global. I'd like to start not with the future, but with the past.
First, Chris, if you invite me to the stage, we can talk about anything you like. I'll join you. I just love being on stage with you, Chris.
That's very kind of you. Thank you, Pat. I'd love to go back to the early days of your career. You've seen a lot of technological shifts. You've participated in a lot of them. What are the lessons that stand out for you when looking at how computing has changed over decades? And what do the lessons imply for where we are today?
Well, as you look back over that period, and I was there with Grove, Moore, and Noyce. I joke that I went through puberty at Intel. Right, I started when I was 18. Right, and if you can have three mentors, right, it's like, okay, the inventor of the integrated circuit, Moore of Moore's Law, and then right, Andy Grove, right, and I joke that mentoring with Andy was like going to the dentist without Novocaine. Right, he was hard, he was tough, he made you better, and Arvind was talking a bit earlier about mentors and so on. But if you think over that period, right, we invented this industry. Right, and in the U.S. and Bell Labs and so on. And like most great technologies and, AI, it's an overnight 50-year success, and transistors were an overnight 40-year success. These things have long gestation cycles, right? And I, recently published the op-ed on sovereign wealth fund, specifically because you need long, patient capital on these hard problems, and quantum's an example of that. We lost the industry to Japan. Right, they spanked us, and then Semitech, and that recovery, and then the seminal decision at Intel, moving from memories to microprocessors, and it just changed everything. Making hard decisions is one of the lessons. Investing for the long term is one of the lessons. And at the end of the day, right, technology wins. Right, you keep pounding on these hard problems, and it's not like the winner becomes dramatically better. They're typically a little bit better, and then they just execute like crazy, and then every time it gets a little bit, better and better and better over time. And of course, hey, global matters. Right, many of the technologies today. I was just in Japan, and hey, I joke that if Japan and U.S. agree, we've decided for the world. Right, because so much of this is the core decisions, right, of those that control the underlying technologies. And having seen the memory wars, the microprocessor wars, the first days of the internet, the role of open standards, right? I was there arguing for unlicensed spectrum for Wi-Fi, and today we just take Wi-Fi for granted. Well, there was a day it wasn't taken for granted. Right, there's 4 competing standards, in the world. So it's just been fabulous watching this industry emerge over time and being able to have this front row seat to so much of it.
I think one of the fascinating parts about your career is that you've played a role both in the manufacturing side as well as the design side as an engineer, as an executive as well. And I think there's widespread agreement. We've underestimated the importance of manufacturing over the last decade or 2 or 3, and are now trying to remedy that in our technology policy. Do you agree with that assessment, and what do we need to do to fix that?
Yeah, I very much agree with it. And Andy Grove and Gordon Moore were just deep believers. Manufacturing and TD, R&D in the semiconductor industry are deeply commingled. Right, every day in a manufacturing line in semiconductors, you're finding a new thing. Right, and then you're putting it back into the process recipe or pushing it forward to the next TD. Manufacturing and semiconductor innovation are deeply commingled. They cannot be separated. Now you can do design, and you have a PDK and an EDA flow, right? I don't care where the manufacturing is done, but in that core technology development, they are deeply intertwined. Always have been, always will be. Every day is a new experiment on a manufacturing flow of semiconductors. And today, this is critically important. right? And clearly, the fragility of our supply chains now was ever evident in COVID, and obviously playing a central role in getting CHIPS Act across the line. We need more resilient supply chains. The McKinsey study, that a major disruption in the semiconductor supply chains is bigger than the Great Depression in its global economic impact. This matters, right? Not just for, can I put PlayStations under the Christmas tree this year, but, the cell phones in everybody's pocket, the economy that goes over the internet, and of course, defense and security. This is the most central thing to humanity's future. Let's make sure we have resilient supply chains for it.
Well, and I'm struck by how many people...
You should write a book on that subject.
It's a good idea.
And by the way, the first draft, it's not too bad, but I have a few corrections for Chip War 2. So.
Well, I always like to think about the TV show Silicon Valley. I'm not sure if you watched it, but you struggle to find a semiconductor in the entire TV show, and it's named after Silicon Valley. And I think that is representative of the way we today conceptualize what advanced technology means, and it, of course, misses the key ingredient.
Yeah, and I think there just ain't much silicon left in Silicon Valley, right? That's right. And if you think about venture capital, of which I've jumped to the dark side, as some have called it, in the 70s and early 80s, and the beginning of the venture capital community, it was all silicon. Right? And today, there's a study last year that would suggest 93% of venture capital in the U.S. was in software, SaaS, the next great dating app, et cetera, right? And don't you think we need another dating app? Yeah, I'm sure, right? An AI-powered one, it's going to be great. So 93%. It used to be 100%, right, in the hard sciences. So it's been a major move in that direction. And obviously, part of the reason I joined Playground is hard tech. Mm-hmm. This matters, manufacturing, hardware. We're about 80% hardware-related investments, so we're so different. And obviously, come to a place like this, here in Illinois in the quantum program. This is hard science. These are hard problems, to solve. But if we solve them, we will change the world again.
Why do you think the venture community moved so far away from its roots in hard tech towards the next great dating app? Was it economically rational, even if it was strategically problematic, or was it driven by something else?
Well, I do think the entire cycle of cloud investments, I think was the determinant. As you saw, these big mega hits of, obviously Google and what you saw with all of the SaaS companies. It's extraordinary, as they rode that internet cycle. Right, it's just extraordinary the amount of capitalization, and obviously look at the top companies by market cap today. Obviously, if you're a venture capitalist, I could do a really hard project that's going to take 10 years to have a return, or I have the opportunity for 100x return in 3 years with one of these cloud guys. It's not hard to see how you got there, but it became so seductive that most of those venerable, critical, powerful venture capital firms, that's all they do now.
Yep.
Right. And that's why we at Playground, we're over here. We believe in hard tech. Show up at Playground. It's an engineer's playground. That's where the name is. We have light labs and chemistry labs and 3D maker labs. That's the stuff we're excited about. Yeah, we do some software as well, but it's usually how do we expose the value of those underlying hardware innovations.
When you brought up the concept of an abstraction layer and thinking about how technology stacks do abstract further and further away from the silicon, on the one hand, America's made a great bet on software the last several decades. You mentioned the big tech firms being software focused primarily, and we dominate the world's software to the extent we don't in any other industry. It's the software industry is American industry. On the other hand, of course, it's led to these vulnerabilities. What's the balance that we ought to try to strike there?
Well, let's take a recent example, right? And we saw DeepSeek basically spanked the AI community, right? Why? Because it skipped all the abstraction and went to the hardware, right? And really understood, the underlying platform and hardware investments. And I do think at that point, abstractions are, important. right? And we build them over time, and they become means by which you expose a broader community to innovate. It's like, how many billion transistors do you do every day, Chris?
Not that many.
Right? No, you do. You're using many billions of transistors in your pocket, in your cloud services every day. Do you understand how the tunneling effects of the transistor work?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Okay, I'll explain it to you, but you don't need to understand it to utilize it. Right? That's the beauty of abstractions. But at the same time, if you lose entire track of the abstractions, you're no longer connected to what really is going on. Right? And I think as we move into the quantum era, for instance, and I call this next era of computing the great trinity. Right? Classical computing, AI computing, and quantum computing, right? Where we truly will open up this next phase. There's not going to be any software abstractions for quantum computing. Back to understanding the hardware, right? Back to understanding what's really going on. And I do think in that there's these episodic phases, right, where most of the money and most of the innovation is occurring higher in the stack. But we see that not only because of quantum computing, but because of the things that will allow us to do again. Right? Where we're going to be able to simulate, the real chemical effects, the next generation materials, what's really going on in, proteins, all these other kind of things. It's going to be a major wave back to really understanding the underlying, technologies. And, I think, we're in the period of time where every technology, if you're a technologist, this is the golden period of humanity. Right? Because all of those problems are going to become solvable. We're going to be throwing open the doors on domains of, hard science that weren't possible before, algorithmic domains. Today you can go to a wet lab and maybe look at 10 chemicals. Tomorrow we're going to be able to simulate thousands of them. This is a thrilling time to be a technologist.
Well, I want to dig into the Trinity concept because I think that's great. But I'd also like to ask about talent first. So if you go back to Noyce and Moore, they were dealing with technologies that were orders of magnitude less complex than you have today. And so geniuses though they were, it's even harder, I think, to be a Noyce or a Moore today because every single aspect, the chemistry, the physics, the program, it's all gotten so much more complex. How do we train the next generation that's capable of dealing with that level of complexity and expertise and specialization across that technology stack?
Well, I do think that a lot of it is, back to basics. Really, it's the mathematics, the engineering, the material science, the chemistry, and the places that we're excited about investing with are the schools that focus in that area. That's why we're here in Illinois. They focus on many of those hard mathematic, sciences. But the complement to that is, as well as, let's just let the best brains on the planet come here to do their best work. Right, and every higher education degree from the U.S. should come stapled with a green card, right? Yeah, everyone, right? Yeah. If the best brains in the world want to do their best work here in the U.S., let them. Come on in, right? And to me, that just is, in that sense, is not just training. And we already have the finest universities in the world, right? In the U.S. Let's let the best brains take advantage of them, and that will result in the best innovations happening here as well.
Well, the other lesson that I took away from studying the history of the chip industry is you had universities investing.
It was a good job, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. You had government investing, but you also had some pretty unique companies that would invest vast sums of money across the business cycle in ways that today many CEOs would think of as being almost reckless. Noyce and Moore, certainly. You had Bell Labs, which was this unique lab within a monopoly. And today I get the sense that a lot of companies are much more focused on their quarterly results rather than the long-term investments that are...
Yeah, I experienced one of those recently.
Well, so tell us generally, how should tech companies think about the long-term investments they need to make?
Yeah, and it's just hard, right? The 90-day shot clock is difficult. Not that I counted, but I had my 51 quarterly earning calls, right, that I experienced. And, it's a 90-day shot clock, right, associated with that, where, meet, beat, raise, profitability, increasing EBIT on a regular basis, that is the metric. And that results in near-termism, right, for what you invest in and what you do. And that's why I wrote recently on sovereign wealth fund as a mechanism to help fill those capital-intensive, periods. But I'm also, pretty encouraged that many of the companies, like, who have quantum programs today, other than Google and IBM and Microsoft. I'm actually encouraged that those leaders, most of them being technologists, Arvind was here on stage, these are technologists, they believe in the value of technology. But, fundamentally, you need long, patient capital to pull this off, right? And that is the antithesis of what's rewarded in our financial markets today. And you either have, dogged determinism, by the leadership and the board of those companies. You need mechanisms, long-term research, and obviously, we're all a little bit concerned about that in the technology community under the, some of the current administration policies. We need to continue to make those generational R&D, investments, and then we need to fill out the portfolio of the capital requirements when you go from proof to scale of manufacturing. So you're putting all of that together. Yeah, these are 40 or 50-year bets. And if we want to lead in the industries of tomorrow, we need to be playing at every level of making those bets.
When you mentioned long-term patient capital, that's not the way our financial system always works, but that does sound a lot like China. Maybe not making the right bets, but making long-term bets at vast scale. Tell us how you think China's doing when it comes to advanced computing.
Well, how many times has semiconductors been in the top 5 priorities of the 5-year plans of China?
Often.
Yeah, consecutively for 14 5-year plans. I think I have my data right there. Okay, they are determined in this space, right? We've had quarters over the last 3-4 years where over half of the world's semiconductor equipment was bought by China. And they represent approximately 20% of the world's supply. Okay, do the math. I'm buying half of the world's equipment, and I'm only supplying 20% of the world's supply. Okay, that's long patient capital by its deepest definition for it. And they've picked industries, the EV industry. At one point in electric vehicles, there were over 200 electric vehicle companies in China, right, that were capitalized, funded, et cetera. And it's very Darwinian. Okay, your company got crushed. I don't care, right? Right? We're ending up with the BYDs, the Geelys, et cetera, to dominate the category. We have the battery supply chain, we have the solar panels, we have the rare earths. These are long, patient capital requirements. And I think if you look at the 10 industries that we would be most concerned about for the long term, 6 or 7 of them now are unquestionably led by China because of long, patient capital commitments.
And the talent ecosystem that I think is maybe
not
not as strong as ours, but pretty close and catching up.
Crushing us in production of engineers and that, and even when you look at some of the, I challenge you to go look at some of the current race on AI talent. What's the heritage of many of them, right? A lot of it comes from Asia. Right? They believe deeply in the value of deep mathematics and algorithms and software and hard sciences as well. So, that's another point on our immigration policy for the future.
Yep, no, that's right. There's great research actually tracking the leading AI papers, where the authors did their undergraduate degree, their graduate school, and work today. And it all finds that the U.S. is still importing large volumes of foreign AI talent, but that the rates have declined in recent years, which is a real worry. If you were advising the U.S. government, I know you occasionally have.
I haven't done that since this week.
What should Washington be doing differently? You've mentioned immigration. What else should Washington be doing differently to maximize our chances in winning these industries in the future?
Yeah, I think it has to be an end-to-end look at the policies and the industries that you want to win. I mean, right now, here we are at a quantum event. I think by every metric, the Chinese are well out investing us in quantum computing. So obviously, this is an area that if we want to dominate for the future, and I believe the most important scientific questions of the next 20 or 30 years will result from quantum computing. So do you want those to occur here or somewhere else? And if so, this is an industry that demands priority. Now, that should get an applause from this audience. If there's any place it should, right? Right. This is it. Come on, right? It's an area you want major investment. Semiconductors. Okay, right? This is critical to the future of it. We've lost the manufacturing element of the industry. Are you going to support CHIPS Act or not? Okay, we got to get very determined in how we both rebuild manufacturing here, but own long-term technology development, right? And as I said, it is thrilling that TSMC is building a third module in Arizona. That's still a tiny portion of its overall capacity, and they do no leading edge and no TD here. Okay, I need leading edge here. I need long-term TD here in the US. So semiconductors, we need to reestablish our position in rare earths, right, as well. Okay, are these going to matter? And I do think, given the first point of quantum computing, we're going to be identifying what the rare earths are for the next generation. I think we actually have the opportunity, right, as we identify what those materials are going to be, I think we actually have the opportunity to position ourselves to, have the partners, that are necessary. And next I'd say is, be friends with our friends, right? Australia has a lot of good dirt, right, for rare earths, right? Okay, let's go partner with them for good dirt, right? Japan, critical in so many areas of these technologies. They believe deeply in what they would be. Our European allies. Be friends with our friends. That have shared interests, shared democratic objectives. And if we don't have export policies and immigration policies, et cetera, that are consistent with our global allies at that level, then it just becomes backdoors of technologies flowing to China. It's critical. So export all of our products, protect our technologies, align with our allies to build sustainability to our core technology industries in the future.
Well, let's go back to the trinity of computing technologies that you started sketching out for us, and use that to look towards the future in which quantum plays a bigger and bigger role in computing. Tell us how you think that emerges. Right now, we've got classical. We're building out AI right now very rapidly, but still in inning one, I think, of a much longer baseball game. Quantum is still on the horizon, but I think coming pretty quickly. What does the future look like? Give us your vision.
Well, I think first, the first generation quantum machines, it'll be sort of like the first generation Cray machines, or the first generation of IBM mainframes.
You should actually remind the audience what a first generation Cray machine is. It might be a small number of us who know what you're referencing.
Fastest high performance computing, and it was sort of special and carefully made. It was sort of like, I got to go into the computer room. I went to the holy of holies, right? And that's, will be those special places. There's not going to be thousands of these. There's going to be few of them, but the problems they solve, take billions of years today on classical machines. So you're going to have these major centers, obviously, Illinois aiming to be, one of them, but, that are going to be able to start solving at scale, quantum problems. Clearly we see, these AI data centers getting built, right? And the big cloud centers today. Increasingly, though, we see the entire tech stack being rebuilt, right? And obviously, silicon, right? If you can do it on a silicon wafer, and that's, I'm quite proud of the PsiQuantum team for doing that on a silicon wafer as they do their BTO, technology. But if I do it in silicon on a 300 millimeter wafer, I leverage trillions of R&D per year. Wow, that's magic, right? This is one of God's gifts to humanity. Silicon, the second most prevalent material on Earth, right? And it is manufacturable, scalable, 4-4 structures. You bend it, you twist it, you add stuff to it. It's just magic. But we're also going to rebuild that with light. Right? We've been talking about moving from copper to optical for decades. So we're going to see that transition, occur in a big way. And God said, let there be light. So silicon and light, right? The two great gifts that we're going to be working with more and more. And then we also see that much of it will happen in cryogenics. Right? We're going to get comfortable and mundane with working at 4 Kelvin, going forward. We just announced our superconducting company, SnowCap, right? Where, that will be, right, making, chips that are 100x power performant. So we're going to start sucking more of the AI and classical compute into, cryogenic computing at dramatically improved performance and efficiency, and then algorithmically classical AI and quantum on top of this new fabric of computing, new thermals, new power delivery, a new software stack emerges, that's taking advantage of algorithmics across all three of those types of computing. And my only disagreement with Arvind's comment here, on stage before is, no, we're going to fill the room with those computing capabilities, not just on the stage, right? It will really allow us to tackle pretty much every problem that is mathematically describable today will become computable tomorrow with the trinity of computing.
Yep. And I think history very clearly shows our demand for computing power is essentially infinite.
Yeah, I've always described it as the gas law, right? Or Jevons law if you're an economist. Yep. And, this idea that, how much AI inferencing do you need? Okay, well, if I make it 10,000 times cheaper, you're going to use a lot.
Yep.
Right? And I love, when you think about some of the AI, we will solve language. Today, maybe 100, 150 languages are well solved today. There's 7,000 more to go. Right? And of these 7,000 more to go, almost everybody who's underprivileged, living in poverty or extreme poverty is in those 7,000. Right? So associated with that, we're going to be able to solve language. Well, that's pretty cool, right? And be able to educate, train, communicate to every child, on the planet. Okay, I think that's going to change poverty, right? As we think to the future, as every child becomes educatable through the power of AI. So solve language, incredible. And, when you think about then, right, the ability to start, running, systems that truly are communicating to everybody, over the last 75 years of computing, we have adjusted to computers, not computers adjusting to us. When I first was dating Linda, who became my wife, she asked me, do you speak any other languages? And I said, yes, I speak 10 and I'm working on English. Fortran, assembler, pro, right?
Yeah. That's a good nerd joke.
Yeah. Anyway, she didn't like it either at the time, but that's okay, right? So on. But now, with AI, computer are going to adjust to us. We're going to talk to it. It's going to know us. It's going to, be present with us. What an extraordinary period where the usages and users become much, much larger as a result. So I think it really is this epic time, to be a technologist and to think deeply about the long-term supply chains, that we want to build. Doing it here, right, on American soil, it's really a unique opportunity to shape the policies right now that allow us to do that for the future.
Well, so if we rewind the clock 30 years ago and ask ourselves what supply chain mistakes would we not have made, I think you and I can identify at least a couple. What are the mistakes we're at risk of making today that we'll regret in 20 or 30 years?
Well, we were chatting backstage a little bit. Supply chains don't form. They sediment, right? And what I mean by that is, right, it takes a long time. You put one factory, okay? Did it move the supply chain when you built a factory? No. But then a subcontractor moves in. And then, a piece part shows up. And then, one by one. And over 30 years, the supply chain sedimented into Southeast Asia. It's not like, we lost to Taiwan semiconductors overnight. Right? It was a 30-year process that our supply chains moved there. And I think what we can do is, right, if we don't think about it in multi-decade sense with our policies, right? And imagine you're a CEO and you're watching the tariff policies today. You make no decisions based on oscillating tariff policies. Because I build a factory, it's going to take me 20 years to recoup the capital investment associated with it. So it needs very consistent long-term policies, and then things start to emerge, tax policies, tariff policies. And to me, in the, if we think about semiconductors properly, I say, I need three things right now, Chris. I want to execute what we started with the CHIPS Act, right? But right next to that, I want to put a sovereign wealth fund-like mechanism for the long-term requirements of building it. And then right next to that, tariffs. Because, if there's not meaningful economic incentive for the restoring of supply chains, they're not going to move. They're going to take forever. 30 years from now, hey, we're going to have moved our supply chains from 11% in the US to 12, right? It takes strong top-down, drive to move things that take decades, to emerge. Strong, consistent policies. And for semiconductors, those are my big three. I hope you agree.
The semiconductor trinity. That's good. We got trinities today. Well, final question. We have an audience, many of whom are working at early stage firms, founding their own firms. You've lived in the tech sector for a long time, seen small
45
firms.
years. Can you believe
45 years, very good.
I started when I was 2, right?
So you've seen medium-sized firms grow global in scale, small firms grow big, seeding small firms to grow very large right now. What are the lessons you have for new entrepreneurs?
Well, obviously, for startup companies, your desire is to build meaningful, sustainable, significant companies, right? First, the product got to be great, right? If your product is 2x better than the incumbent product, you suck. You're not going to win, right? It got to be 10x better or more, for you to have a chance to really break through, right? When you do that, then you got to be manically focused on satisfying those early customers. Right, they just got to love you, right? You're so much better, right? And you service them super well. And then you have to build a company, right? A team, a culture. Having a great idea with a great product ain't enough to build a great company. You have to build a real sustainable entity. And for that, with our playground companies, that's one of the things I want to bring to the table. How do we create big, sustainable, significant, companies, for the long term? And then every company is susceptible to the innovator's dilemma, as Clayton Christensen called it. What are you doing today to be disrupting yourself for tomorrow, right? And as we think about this period of time where things are changing so much, right? We're gonna, PsiQuantum's gonna build the first, million qubit utility scale computing, right? Awesome, really. Now, how do we make sure that we're the first 5 to 10 to 15 to 20? We're the first ones to reduce the overhead going from physical qubits to logical qubits. How do we go deliver sustainable results in these different vertical industries that will be redefined as a result? The only way to be ahead is to be ahead, right? And you got to be investing in the way that we want to be ahead for the next 30, 40, 50 years, and a company that I want to help build other companies that want to do exactly that.
Well, that's, I think, an inspiring place to end. Pat, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, Senator Dick Durbin here. Welcome to the Global Quantum Forum. Thank you to P33, the Chicago City Council, and Intersect Illinois for hosting. Illinois knows a thing or two about the value of scientific research and innovation. We are home to Argonne and Fermilab, 2 world-class national laboratories that have been developing critical elements in the supercomputers that now are being researched around the world. Our research universities are helping lead the way to discover new medical cures and agricultural techniques. And now we're taking exciting steps to help secure our state as a leader in quantum computing, a sector that can help accelerate drug discovery, improve financial transactions, and more. I want to thank Governor Pritzker for his leadership on this. Later this year, we're slated to break ground on a $500 million Illinois quantum and microelectronics park, which will make the south side of Chicago a hub of quantum innovation. At the federal level, I've supported investing in scientific research to keep the United States in the lead in innovation. Earlier this year, I reintroduced the Department of Energy Quantum Leadership Act, which would grow federal investment in quantum research and development by up to $1.7 billion. Thanks for all the work you're doing to support Illinois in this sector in the future. Together, Illinois can lead the quantum revolution.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Tammy Duckworth. I wanted to thank you for coming from all over the world to attend the Global Quantum Forum, taking place in the state that I believe will be one day will be the worldwide leader in quantum, Illinois. The critical conversations you're having will be the fuel for the breakthroughs that we need to ensure that the United States takes hold of global leadership on quantum and never gives it back. Investing in quantum can't just be a side project or a half-hearted bet. No, instead, it's one of the most important things we can do to guarantee American national security, spur economic development, and prepare our country for the century to come. And Illinois will be the place where we will make it happen. From our world-class universities to our superior talent to our strategic location, we have everything we need right here. I have already worked with many of you on this crucial mission, and I look forward to our continued partnership. Thank you, and I welcome you all back to Illinois anytime.
Well, for part two of our conversation, I'm excited to welcome two experts, Nalamasu, CTO of Applied Materials, Steve Brierley, CEO of Riverlane, to talk about the quantum computing supply chain as it's developing right now and over course in the earlier stages of what's going to be, I think, a fascinating industry over not just years, but over decades. So we'll try to look a little bit into the future and see what we can ascertain. Steve, let me start with you if I can. Perhaps first give us a bit of background on what you do at Riverlane and the role you play in the quantum computing supply chain.
Yeah, sure. So at Riverlane, we're solving quantum error correction. And it turns out that quantum error correction is really a classical problem. You obviously need to build qubits, but you also need to solve the classical data processing problem. And so just as GPUs were needed to scale out AI workloads, so the chips that Riverlane designs are needed to scale out quantum computers.
Fantastic. And you work at a semiconductor company primarily, but spending more time in the quantum computing space as well. Give us a bit of a view into how Applied Materials is thinking about the quantum.
Absolutely. A little bit about myself. I spent first 17 years of my career at Bell Labs. And I was working on lithography at that time. Then after that, I went to academia as vice chancellor at RPI for about 4 years. And the last 17 years, I've been at Applied. And Chris, as you know, Applied is a leading wafer fab equipment company. Basically, we provide technology to our customers like TSMC, Samsung, and Intel, Micron, and others. And we believe that what we do, we call materials engineering. What it really means is atomic control on an engineering scale, atomic control on an industrial scale. And what it really means is the ability to create materials, modify materials, shape materials, being able to measure them with atomic precision. And that is essentially at the heart of making semiconductors today. And we believe if you take the quantum technologies, there is an opportunity to repurpose, tailor this technology to build robust qubits. And if you look at the status of building qubits today, I would like to think the technology is of the 80s and 90s. And there is this tremendous innovation. Trillions of dollars have been invested in building semiconductor chips and transistors, packaging technologies. And there is an opportunity to repurpose that for building robust, high-volume manufacturing compatible qubits.
When you started your career at Bell Labs, which for a long time was participating in every single layer of the semiconductor ecosystem, building its own design software, building deposition tools, manufacturing test chips, making chemicals and photoresists and silicon wafers in the earliest days. And then over time, we've seen the industry split out into many different segments, which has been necessary to create the specialization as well as to make the economics work. Tell us the lessons that you've drawn from watching that process play out in the chip industry, and what does it mean for the quantum industry and where it's going?
So I started in the business in 1986, and I was going to do lithography, and people told me that you would be out of job soon because the limits of being able to fabricate transistors is going to end around 2-micron design rules.
So about an order of magnitude or 3 orders of magnitude off. Right?
So we're just making 2-nanometer devices. And as you pointed out, the companies were vertically integrated, right? You were doing all the way from crystal growth to finished devices and systems. So the stratification has come in, and as the scale has gone up, the efficiencies have gone up because companies are focusing on individual layers. And actually, I kind of begin to see that take place in quantum in the very early stages, right? There are companies that are building qubits. There are companies that are doing the middleware, error correction. Then there are companies that are working on software and solutions that are domain-specific or market-specific. So you can kind of begin to see that already, and that's where you get the scale. You get economies of scale. You get the economic benefits associated with that, and you build robust supply chains.
Well, Steve, maybe that's a good point to turn over to you, since you're building one of those companies that is focused on one segment of the quantum stack, if you will, the quantum supply chain. Tell us how you see that process of differentiation in the supply chain. What are the challenges, and what's the opportunity set for focusing on just one segment?
Yeah, so I think I think it comes from these two same factors from the semiconductor industry. I mean, firstly, in quantum error correction, there's a big challenge in terms of the talent. Right? I mean, there are perhaps 300 people in the world who understand quantum error correction. And so bringing those people together in one place has enormous benefits. Like they really grow from each other. And we see that at Riverlane. I mean, we employ about 100 of those 300 people. And then the second thing is also scale. Like, as quantum computers get bigger, the error correction problem becomes increasingly difficult. So it's actually quite easy to solve the real-time data processing problem on 100 qubits, but at 1 million qubits, we'll be processing on the order of 100 terabytes per second. Now, that's like Netflix global streaming. So the only way you're going to solve that problem is to build dedicated processors. And so I see this happening in quantum, that like where there's a specific set of skills and where it makes sense to bring the skills together, and where the scale of the problem grows very large and is sufficiently common across the industry, then it makes sense to concentrate the resources into one company in one place, and then spread that cost across the whole industry. So we can help everybody solve quantum error correction, and there's just a much greater economic benefit to doing so.
And it seems the other aspect is that a company like yours is not only solving a quantum-related problem, there's also a massive traditional computing set of challenges that stem from having to build this vast data processing capacity. Can you tell us about the challenges of integrating the quantum problem solving and the just classical data center management problem solving that you have to undertake?
Right, I think that's a great point. So like, we also employed a different type of skill. So at Riverlane, there's a lot of kind of discrete maths, and there's chip design expertise, and that's very complementary to, at a quantum computing company, you've got typically more physicists and materials scientists skill set. So yeah, I think right now we have a lot of kind of algorithms and maths, and we're designing a lot on the whiteboard, and first generation products are taking those ideas and testing them out in hardware. I mean, over time though, I see the company growing actually with way more traditional semiconductor chip design expertise. And I mean, this is why I founded the company in Cambridge, because ARM is headquartered in Cambridge and has a lot of, it's one of the global centers for chip design expertise. And that really becomes the much bigger problem as we scale up.
And I think also it illustrates some of what Pat was just discussing in terms of the trinity of computing, classical AI and quantum. You're having to work with all three just to deliver quantum at scale. Is that an accurate way of phrasing it?
Right, and I definitely agree. Like, I mean, solving problems, you got to start from like, I want to solve a problem. What compute do I need? Even within the quantum computer, there's a lot of classical semiconductors. There's microwave generation. There's the decoding, the error correction stack that we're working on. There's a whole bunch of classical compiling. There's so much richness there in the problem set. And I actually think this is an amazing time to join the quantum computing industry. Like, for people who are working in other fields, we've had kind of 20 years where largely it's been a relatively small community of people working on quantum computing, very excited about the space. But now we need more skills to come and help us scale that up.
And I think it's a great analogy to the early days of the chip industry. There were a disproportionate number of physicists present at Bell Labs in the 1950s or 60s. And now if you look at chip companies, like the design companies or the EDA companies, they'll have no one with a physics degree. They're all expert in other disciplines because you need to draw in more types of expertise as you build this specialization. If you look at applied materials, a great example of how the pyramid on which all of our tech applications sit is inverted. You've got trillions of dollars of value sitting on top of chips that are produced by chip companies who now also have trillions of dollars of market capitalization. And then at the bottom, there's a smaller number of companies, very profitable, very valuable, very skilled, but nevertheless a smaller number that enable the rest of the ecosystem. And in quantum, I guess we're still moving in that direction. Having watched that develop in the chip industry, watched the specialization that occurs, what needs to happen in the quantum space to reach that point where we have these highly specialized companies on which the rest of the ecosystem can depend?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. But before I answer that, a show of hands, how many read Chip War? If you haven't, you should. It's one of the best books you could read. And I actually gave it as a Christmas gift for my entire executive staff and family members 2 Christmases ago. So it's a beautiful book, reads like a novel, technology book. It's not an easy task, so that's a great job. So if I look at making better qubits, it's about designing a chip, fabricating a chip, basically lithography and materials engineering, and testing and essentially building a system, right? If I look at building better qubits involves much more of materials engineering. If you're looking at lithography, these are roughly 80 micron design rules. You can actually write with a pen. You don't need any UV lithography. And from our perspective, this is really about interface engineering. There are 3 things that need to be solved to build better, robust qubits that are HVM compliant. The first one is basically reducing the error rates. Today, you're somewhere around 1%. And you need about 200,000 physical qubits for 1 logical qubits in the context of superconducting qubits. If you can reduce the error rate to 0.001%, you only need 10 physical qubits for 1 logical qubit. So we're working with customers in actually reducing the error rate to 0.01%, 1 to 2 orders of magnitude on where we need to be, but significantly better than where we started. So we need only 200 physical qubits for 1 logical qubit. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to make sure that the interface doesn't have any dangling bonds. It doesn't have point defects. It doesn't have any residue. You're trying to reduce the quasi-particle tunneling. You're trying to stop any of the energy dissipation at that interface. The second thing you need to do is really increase coherence time and coherence length. You need to go from something like 10 to 100 microseconds in the case of superconducting qubits, possibly to milliseconds. And we could demonstrate that we can get up till 800 microseconds. And the third one is that you need to have uniformity. So, and similar considerations apply if you're looking at alternate technologies. If you're looking at photonic-based qubits, you want to have lowest loss waveguides in the milli-dB regime. You want to have single photon detectors that can operate at higher TC than they're currently operating at. And if you're looking at neutral atoms or if you're looking at ion traps, there are similar materials engineering problems that need to be solved. The beauty is that much of the technology already exists. And it is a question of the ecosystem coming together and building HVM compliant quantum chips, basically, repurposing the technologies that are already out there. So Pat was talking about silicon has gone out of Silicon Valley. I think it's largely true, but we as a company are bringing back silicon into Silicon Valley. Talk is cheap. Actually, we're investing $5 billion in building a state-of-the-art collaboration center to work with our customers, universities, and startups, and in the context of semiconductors. But presumably, some of that could be used even in the context of quantum. So I think there has to be a different way to think about from where we are to where we need to go to build a robust quantum computing ecosystem in the United States. You were also talking about the competitive landscape with Pat. So if you look at the quantum landscape, United States has invested about $6 billion of public money cumulatively so far. China has invested 15, and Europe has invested $15 billion. Japan has invested $9 billion. Last year, 52% of the patents issued in the quantum technologies went to China. So we are in a quantum race, and we need to think differently, and we need to think at full stack in being able to do the hardware, middleware, and the software and applications algorithms together.
So you mentioned the concept of moving technologies from R&D to high volume manufacturing. And you've worked in Bell Labs and research, you've worked in academia, now you work for a company that's expertise is nanometer level precision at high volume manufacturing. What are the lessons from the chip industry about manufacturing by the billions of chips that the quantum industry needs to learn?
So if you look at the semiconductor industry, there have been long lead times from discovering a new material to its implementation in manufacturing and on-wafer performance. People who have been in the semiconductor industry know whether it is copper technology or high-k metal gate, it took a good 15 years from the first publication to on-wafer performance. So I think one needs to be thinking about different models in bringing this ecosystem. In some small way, we are trying to do this in the EPIC Center that we're actually trying to build in Silicon Valley. So I think there are some lessons that we learned in the semiconductor industry kind of help us on how we should think differently as we think about quantum race and how we need to learn from the mistakes that we have made over the time so we don't make the same mistakes, maybe make some new ones.
Well, Steve, let me turn to you. We've talked about the material science undergirding the manufacturing of different types of qubits. But Steve, you're working with, you're qubit neutral in terms of the types of qubits that you could work with. So when you think about the ecosystem as it develops, and you're building a company that is designed to be qubit neutral from the outset, walk us through what you think the market is going to look like for the rest of the technology stack, both from what you're building, but also for other companies that might be also looking to enter, not at the qubit level, but higher up the stack.
Yeah. Well,
let me bring in Steve first if I can.
Yeah, please.
Steve.
So Hermann Hauser, one of the founders of Acorn that then span out ARM, is on our board. And one of the things he said very early on when I was building the company was, it's all about the interfaces. Right? I don't mean like physical interfaces. I mean like company to company interfaces. Like if you can find a common interface across multiple companies, then you have a right to exist. And I think this is easy to say, but it's very hard to do. And it requires a lot of kind of coming together, trying out things with different people. And one of the interesting things I think about quantum is that like everybody is trying to build their company and figure out like their role all at the same time. And we have, it's such a fast moving space. Like we've had waves of quantum where, there was a SPAC boom in 2021, right? It was like suddenly money was free and like you had a bunch of pretty small research groups basically list on the NASDAQ. And And then that ended, and suddenly then money was expensive again. And so people were thinking, oh, maybe I want to save some money. And now money is more freely available. So I think these kind of, like, you have this whole ecosystem emerging, and then these like external forces of capital and where it's coming from. And I think this is one of the brilliant things about quantum, that this is all, we're getting to create this industry from the beginning. And so I think it really comes down to relationships that you build with people. You find people who have the same perspective as you. I mean, for us, it's always been very long-term thinking of like, quantum error correction is going to be essential to any useful quantum computer. We're going to have to build substantial scale to get to utility. We really started building that from the beginning, and that meant that we had a group of like-minded people in the industry who had that same view. And I think figuring out then, how are we going to work? What are we going to do, and what are you going to do? Like, that is really the conversation. And so over time, these interfaces start to emerge. There's sometimes they happen quickly, but sometimes it takes a lot of just work. So I think as people are thinking about, hey, I want to build a company that solves this particular problem. It's like, well, what's the interface to you with other people in this ecosystem? How is that? How are you complementing what's happening already? Or what are you going to solve, and what are other people going to solve?
And if you look at the development of the chip industry, the emergence of those interfaces are most successful when there is thought-free as possible. When you don't have to think at all about what's on the other side of that interface, you just get your PDK and you know it's going to work when you take it to the fab, for example. I sense we're some distance away from interfaces you don't have to think very hard about as a user.
Yeah, I think also that it comes to sort of abstractions as well. Like you were talking with Pat about this. Like you can't abstract too big, too high up too soon, right? So abstractions are very helpful in that they allow other people to come in with different skills. But you can also go too far, and then there's nothing left to do. And actually, we've already seen this a few times in quantum, where people have built, for example, compiler stacks, which basically imagine a perfect, large-scale, well-functioning quantum computer, and there's just then nothing left to do, right? And so the interesting abstractions or the interesting kind of access modes are actually much lower in the stack. So I think this is very pertinent right now. So today, we have essentially the ability to build the first generation of error-corrected quantum computers. And these are, right now, pretty small. They're small scale. They can do a few logical qubits. So now is not the time to abstract to, let's imagine we have perfect logical functioning qubits, but actually to figure out, well, how exactly am I going to build those logical qubits? Because there's many ways to implement error correction. There's a whole ton of coding, like quantum coding theory that we need to figure out. Like there are almost certainly new codes that we don't yet know about that could be more efficient, that could improve this rate of physical to logical qubits. So this is really the playground right now is in figuring out how best to do quantum error correction. Over time, that will be more well understood, and perhaps like the pyramid will look a bit more like it does in the classical semiconductor company industry, that then people will build on top the applications. So I think right now we're really at this error correction era. That's why I think it's such an exciting time.
Well, let's talk a bit about business models, which ultimately are key to the growth of this ecosystem, the companies inside of it. Right now, the list of customers is small and mostly governments that are procuring quantum computers. The same was true, of course, in the early days of the classical computing industry when it was research labs, universities, and governments. How long is that going to be the case? When should we expect to see our first significant commercial customers? And are governments procuring enough quantum computing right now to really give the ecosystem the liftoff that it needs? Steve, I'm sure you've got views on that, being someone who's selling quantum computing services on a regular basis.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. Right now, government is basically 100% of the market, and that's because although you could buy a quantum computer, you could simulate that quantum computer with your laptop. So you don't really need to buy one. And so governments are procuring them because it creates an industry, there's a huge economic benefit. There's also national security benefits of being the first to build that technology. And I think actually, that's going to be true until we get to the first generation of error-corrected quantum computers. I I think this will occur in generations. So this first generation, it'll be a bit like kind of as we had in mobile networks. 2G was the first time that error correction was brought into mobile networks and enabled the car phone, right? It's going to be like that in quantum computing. The first generation will have perhaps 100 logical qubits and be capable of doing 1 million error-free operations. Right? This is absolutely amazing. Today you can do about 1,000 operations before the computer fails. So there's a big step up in capability, and that's going to be amazing because it will be impossible to directly simulate that quantum computer. So if you just wanted to simulate everything that quantum computer could do, it's no longer possible. You'd need billions and trillions of GPUs to do that. Now, that's not to say that quantum computer can solve a huge number of problems. It will be quite a limited set, but we'll start to see the first applications in, I think, particularly in materials design. These problems map very well onto the quantum computer, and so the smaller scale problems that we'll first solve will be in that domain. And I think this will show significant glimpses into the future. And I think at that point, then it's no longer true to say, oh, I don't need to buy a quantum computer in order to test out ideas. Now there's no other way. So I think we could see at that point investment in infrastructure, as in compute infrastructure, kind of in the same way that we've had big increases in investment in AI infrastructure before the full potential was really clear. And just to be clear, that's the first generation, right? I mean, there'll be subsequent generations after that substantially increase the capability. And the good news for quantum error correction is really hard, but the good news is once you get it working, it actually has a relatively modest overhead. So the next generation systems will be capable of 1 billion error-free operations. And then the generation after will be 1 trillion error-free operations. And that's where really we're headed in terms of, okay, we know a lot of massive potential applications in that space.
And I like the analogy with AI. We're in the early stages of AI, but we've nevertheless shown enough potential to draw in hundreds of billions of dollars of private capital to build out that infrastructure. Back to you. You work at one of America's largest tech companies, very successful in the semiconductor sphere, looking at quantum, which right now is, I'm going to guess, close to 0% of revenue, but could be large in the future. How do big companies that are primarily playing in other spheres balance the need to keep focusing on their core businesses with the desire to make sure they're both serving and responding to the capabilities that quantum are beginning to bring to the table?
With any new inflection, you never get the timing right. So you have to believe that this is a big inflection that can shape tomorrow's world. Then you have to find a way to be able to invest in a way collaboratively with the ecosystem. So, for example, we've been part of the Chicago Quantum Exchange for quite a while. So you have a seat at the table, you're working with leading university researchers, you're working with leading national labs. We have a venture fund that reports to me. We have about 100 deep tech companies we have invested in 21 countries. So this is a way we have our finger on the pulse with respect to what are the inflections that are coming down the pike. And our culture has been that we want to work with our customers on high-value problems. So a few years ago, we had a thesis on what quantum computing could be, what are some of the high-value problems, and what can applied materials do to enable. And we have landed up in a place that high-volume manufacturing technology need to be developed for qubits, as I mentioned, reduce the error rates, increase the coherence time and length, and basically bring uniformity. Then we begin to work with different customers on some of these high-value problems. And that's what we're currently doing. We're working at about 8 or 10 different customers on different aspects of different quantum computing technologies. And I think the next stage for the United States, I believe, is for the ecosystem to come together and come with a roadmap. If you look at semiconductor industry, There is the International Technology Roadmap for Semiconductors. The entire industry works together, basically going down the path of realizing that roadmap. And in fact, within that context, you are trying to compete with each other on who can get there first. Then different companies are actually going to produce products and services based on the technologies that you're developing. I think there is an opportunity for something similar to happen in the world of quantum computing, where you need to bring players from different parts of this pyramid to come work together in a public-private partnership startup mode and really solve important problems, so you're creating an industry.
Well, I know you're spending a lot of time trying to find the best ways to use AI to accelerate your own materials research.
Yeah.
Can you already begin to glimpse the impact that quantum technologies will have on the types of R&D that Applied Materials undertakes?
Yeah, I think there are some ideas that we're interested in pursuing where quantum could be a fit. So if you're actually looking at inside a plasma reactor, pretty complicated chemistry that goes on there. Presumably, quantum is a fit to interrogate what's taking place and give you better insights to come up with a better process for etching, as an example. So I think there are lessons that we could learn from deploying the AI, using the AI for productivity, discovery, to thinking about how quantum could be helpful in solving problems on one hand, and enabling quantum on the other hand.
And how far away do you think we are from you and I being on stage and you telling me I'm confident that quantum has accelerated our R&D processes?
So I have a technical advisory board that has 3 Nobel Prize winners and 2 quantum pioneers, actually, including Paul Alvisatos, who's the president of University of Chicago. So we have taken a poll on when would there be a ChatGPT movement for quantum technology. So the number seems to be somewhere between 5 to 7 years. And what I mean by that is that quantum computing would be able to solve problems that cannot be solved by classical computing of some commercial significance.
So this poll reminded me of something. Back in 2015, I was working on quantum algorithms. In other words, like, what could you do with a useful quantum computer if you could build one? And I was presented this new algorithm at a conference. It's like all the great and the good of quantum computing. And there was this straw poll of when would there be a useful quantum computer? And 1/3 of the audience voted for never. There would never be a useful quantum computer. That was 10 years ago. And it sparked me to go back and ask people, the physicists in the lab, so people like Jeremy, who at that time were in Bristol, people like Peter Leak, who were working on superconducting circuits, just how good are you at building a quantum computer? And how good were you last year and the year before? And I think that's where you see this trend, and it was actually apparent then. There was already kind of 15 years of data of a kind of Moore's law type trend in 2-qubit fidelities. I mean, you mentioned this, this is the key thing. This is the hard physical gate that you're trying to implement. And it'd been basically doubling in fidelity every 12 to 18 months across all of the qubit modalities. And I think actually the surprising thing is that back then I would have thought, well, one of these qubits is going to make it, but several of them are going to get stuck. There'll be some physics that just blocks the development. And actually that hasn't happened. So we still have 5 or 6, depending on how you count, different qubit modalities, all that have continued to progress and all that look like they'll get to the point where they can build this first generation of error-corrected quantum computers. I mean, what happens after that is to be determined, but I think this now 25-year trend is very convincing. I think that explains why you've seen the shifts in investments from both governments and the private sector.
Yesterday, Dario Gil was on one of the panels, and he was making the point accurately that human beings are terrible at understanding the impact of exponential technologies. And this is one of those exponential technologies.
Well, I think that's a great point on which to conclude. Doubling every 12 to 18 months sounds very familiar
Yes.
To me as someone who spent time in the classical computing space. And so if that continues to hold, I think you're both right. Exponential growth is a tremendous force. Thank you so much for the conversation. And the audience can please join me in thanking Steve and Ohm for these insights.
Thank you, Chris.